back to another episode of the InfoSec and Oatson Show. This is episode 79, and I'm your host, Josh Amishav. This week we're going to do a deep dive into the science behind social engineering, microexpressions, FACS, which is the facial action coding system, common mistakes made during SE engagements, manipulation techniques, and more. To help us, we've got Mike Murr on the show. Mike is really at the intersection of human behavior and security. He's a professional social engineer who helps companies legally employ the concepts of detection, deterrence, deception, and neutralization. And now, here's my conversation with Mike. Mike Murr, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, who are you and what do you do?
Well, as you mentioned, my name is Mike Murr. Um, I like to kind of summarize it as I do things that end in engineering. So I spend a lot of time actually doing reverse engineering. I work with malicious code a lot. And then the flip side of that is social engineering. And it's not so much the social engineering that we tend to think of in InfoSec, which is what I call the four Ps, which kind of sums up a lot of social engineering in InfoSec. It's phishing, phone calls, pop psychology, and pseudoscience. Instead, I tend to focus on closer to what would be called like human source intelligence. So I do I specialize more in in-person social engineering, elicitation, so eliciting information out of people, interview, interrogation, that type of stuff. So kind of two halves to that.
Cool. So how do you let's focus on the social engineering bit. How do you define social engineering in the concept of I guess persuasion?
So the way I look at social engineering and think about it is a little bit differently than a lot of people in the infosec field tend to define it. Um, so from my perspective, social engineering is more about the manipulation of human behavior in a clandestine fashion so as to facilitate achieving some strategic or tactical objective. So if we kind of break that down a little bit, um, there are a couple of elements there, right? So there's the manipulation of human behavior, because really at its core, social engineering is all about the manipulation and control of human behavior. And this is something that a lot of people tend to forget about. They tend to focus on a lot of other things and really forget that at its core, that's really what social engineering is about. It's about the manipulation of human behavior, but it's more than just that. Uh, so when we talk about manipulation, really, that's kind of an umbrella. I'm using it as an umbrella term to mean the acquisition, the maintenance, and exploitation of the control of human behavior. So, human behavior itself, we kind of define as a person's interaction with the environment. Um, and what that means is it's more than just like physical movements, right? So, if we were to say something like, someone extended their wrist and turned their hand or something of that nature, that wouldn't be so much behavior as it would be considering what else is included in the environment. For instance, they open a door, right? So not only is there the movement, but there's also the interaction with the environment. And this kind of gets a little bit more philosophical, I guess. When we say an environment, we mean both the world, right, outside a person's skin and inside, right? Because obviously, what happens outside has an effect on who we are and how we behave, but also, what happens inside of us, right? What we would kind of call emotions and stuff like that, which is kind of an overloaded term. Plus, so really that interaction component is what's important, um, especially when it comes to when we talk about how to control human behavior.
Okay, so what are if you're going to be a bit more specific, what are the factors that affect a person's behavior that we can influence to affect the person's behavior?
Sure. So, so when we get into some of the tools, it kind of helps to have a little background on the general approach I take to social engineering, which is based on the scientific analysis of human behavior. So, in terms of science, one of the things about science is that accuracy trumps almost everything else, right? So, a scientist, for example, when talking about, let's say, human behavior, a good scientist, at least, will limit what they say, right, to avoid making unfounded inferences and other things like that. They'll also restrict themselves to what they can observe and measure. So these are kind of some of the basic principles or attitudes of science. Things like what we call empiricism, restricting yourself to empirical data. Parsimony, otherwise known as Occam's razor, which is sometimes misstated as the simplest answer is the most correct answer. If you actually look it up, Occam's razor was originally things should not be multiplied unnecessarily, which means things shouldn't be introduced unnecessarily. So when we talk about the factors that affect people's behavior, factors such as things we can't observe or things that we're inferring, right? Just stating that, oh, they are the cause really doesn't play, at least when it comes to science. Also, understanding of an application of how science applied to human behavior works as well. In fact, if you read a lot of like pop psychology books, like almost anything by everything by Malcolm Gladwell, really, um, he loses or maybe never understood in the first place kind of some of these basic ideas and how they apply to science. And so, one of the ways that in practice you kind of get limited by science would be this goal of accuracy, right? With science, accuracy is paramount to pretty much everything else. In fact, scientists in theory are supposed to bend over backwards to try and disprove themselves, right? They come up with a theory, maybe that, they have some, experiments they may use to measure that theory, but they also need a good scientist would go bend over backwards to try and figure out everything that's wrong or they might have misjudged or so on and so forth. So while accuracy is paramount in science from a practical limitation, we also have to make sure that we can move forward with an interaction or an engagement, right? It'd be nice if we could spend 1,000 years measuring one person's behavior before we decide to before we decide how to manipulate it, but that's just not going to work in real life. So well, let's start with a little simple non-human example of how to manipulate, right? So let's say we talk about a car, or let's be a little bit more specific, like the direction a car is moving. So how do you manipulate or control that? Well, in most vehicles, you'll probably be turning the steering wheel, right? You turn the steering wheel one direction, the car goes that direction. So kind of if we look at it another way, there's a relationship between the direction you turn the steering wheel and the direction the car moves. So there are a couple of fundamental components there. First of all, there's the thing that we want to manipulate. In this case, it would be the direction the car is moving. In science, they call that the dependent variable. And then we also have the thing that causes the change in the thing we want to manipulate. So in this case, that would be the direction we turn the steering wheel. And in science, this is typically known as the independent variable. There's also a relationship between those two types of things, right? The direction that we turn the steering wheel, we turn it to the right, the car goes right. Uh, so the relationship is between the direction we turn the steering wheel and the direction the car goes. And this is kind of what gives us the names dependent and independent. So we say that the dependent variable, the thing we want to manipulate, depends upon the independent variable, the direction of we turn the steering wheel, and that relationship between the two in science is what's called a functional relation. That is, the direction of the car is a function of the direction, or the direction the car goes is a function of the direction you turn the steering wheel.
Okay, can you give like a just so, like if you were to translate the theory into practice, right? So you have a target, you want them to, I don't know, let's say you're sending a phishing email, you want them to create a certain action. How are you translating the theoreticals that like we've been talking about into
Sure.
practice?
All right. So let's say let's pick a specific action. So let's say you want them to click on a link, right, in the email. So first of all, let's look at the behavioral history of most people when it comes to emails, right? What's the purpose of a link? To click on it.
Click. Yeah.
I mean, that's what, by definition, that's kind of what a link is. If you've never seen an email or if you've never seen a link before, right, it's kind of hard to imagine nowadays, but imagine someone who's brand new to computers, they probably wouldn't know what to do. So in the case of like putting a link in a phishing email, we're taking advantage of behaviors that people have already learned in a very similar fashion to if you want someone to answer the phone, if you make a ringing noise, they're more likely to answer it. Um, Now, to increase the likelihood they click on the link, right, we can take a look at some of the other factors that might be involved. So when we talk about a classic example is let's say you have kids. I don't know. Do you have kids or
Yes.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, yeah,
They're in
a bunch of
school.
kids. Yes,
You tons of kids. Wow. So, are they in elementary school, high school, junior high
both,
school,
both, all of
both?
the
All of
above.
the above. All right. So, let's say that there was a emergency that happened at the school, right? One of whichever child's school. You receive an email that says, "Hey, Josh, we know that you probably heard about the emergency at school today. Please don't call us because we don't want the phone lines to be tied up. Instead, please click on this link." So what we've done there is we've made the likelihood of you clicking on that link increase, or we've increased that likelihood by changing some of the situational variables that have happened before. In this case, adding the text about supposed incident at the child's school. I wish, by the way, I wish I could take credit for that example. It actually came from Dr. Eric Cole. Um, but one of the things that we think about is, why would you be more likely to click on that link in that case? Well, presumably there's some type of inborn relationship between parent and child, right? Concerned about safety and stuff like that. And presumably too, that when you've received email in the past from what appears to be the child's school, it's probably yielded some type of useful information, right? So whether it be, hey, upcoming parent teacher night, hey, upcoming event at your child's school, right? So we're taking advantage of all those prior interactions and then using that to increase the likelihood you click on a link. There's still no guarantee that you're going to click on that link, though. I mean, there's nothing like forcing you. Even technically, if someone sat there with a gun pointed at your head, it's still not forcing you to click on the link. It might not be wise to not click on the link, but at the same time, right? Technically, nothing is forcing you, right? You still have free will, so to speak. Now, the way I typically think about this type of stuff is, at least the way I do it a lot more, because I tend not to do so much phishing emails, unless they're very, very targeted, kind of like that example, but is more during social interactions, right? So let's say we want to get someone talking. Like, uh, let's say we eventually want to elicit some information from them about, oh, I don't know, maybe some of the upcoming corporate numbers, like financial numbers from their organization before they get released, right? Perhaps that's what my customer needs to know. So we'll come up with a game plan of how we generally want to steer the conversation, right? So some major waypoints that we want to hit along the way. But what's also important is, how do we keep that conversation going? And so something sometimes as simple as like a smile, right? Or agreement with what they're talking about can help. It will many people will find reinforcing. So the idea is that can help keep the conversation going. Alternatively, if
So
they're
what does that
starting,
mean? They mean you just repeat what they say, or you confirm what they say? What does that mean in practice?
so it could mean several different things. It could mean repeat what they say. Um, it could be there's kind of a classic phrase called power words or end words, where you repeat the last thing someone says. So if they let's say we start off by talking about the weather, right? That's just like first time you walk up to someone, you need something kind of neutral, so you talk about the weather, and you say, you know, man, look at this weather. It's really cold out, right? Because it's November right now. And say, yeah, it's really cold. They're cold. They say, yeah, I've been freezing. I've been freezing all day. Say, wow, that kind of sucks. Well, good thing we're inside right now, right? And so you cannot kind of repeat what they say and kind of facilitate them continuing to speak. Alternatively, something even like literally just like smiling, nodding, and agreeing with someone when someone is speaking. Like especially once you've started to get the conversation going, you typically want to keep it going, right? Because if the conversation stops dead cold, you're not moving forward anywhere. You're not moving towards your goal. So, all right, all of those things that are happening after they speak, those are the consequences we're talking about, right? So, if you and I are looking at each other right now and we're talking, right, there's not much going on. All right, one of us is saying something, and then the other person just doesn't respond. Even right now, it's hard for your listeners to see because they're listening, but you're smiling and laughing, right? Um, And so that's, kind of telling me, hey, he's paying attention. He's interested in what I'm saying or whatever it happens to be, right? And we continue moving the conversation along. Um, and then at the same time, Also, kind of means doing things like maintaining eye contact, right? Speaking to someone face to face, whether virtually like we are now or in person, right, has a different effect than if you're talking to them on the phone. Imagine what happens if you're talking to someone and they look away. It becomes very disconcerting while you're talking, right? And you're probably less likely to talk. Or, depending on the person, maybe they try and grab you and get your attention back. Now, from a social engineer's perspective, one thing that's important is that when we talk about all these like kind of like abstract scientific factors and stuff like that, like a consequence after your behavior and so on and so forth, is to realize that every person's behavioral history is different. So the specific things, the specific interactions that will reinforce or strengthen their behavior or punish or weaken it may vary. So, like if I were to turn away, right, while we're talking, and you stop talking, then I would think to myself, that's I probably should, whatever I said didn't sit well with Josh. Versus if all of a sudden I reach over and grab you, that tells me that that would tell, or that would tell, or let's say you grab me rather, sorry, that would tell me as a social engineer that, hey, my attention is quite reinforcing to you, so I can use that to start steering the conversation. So if I want you to keep talking about something, I might turn my head to keep you going, right? If that's what reinforces you. So you've also got to kind of assess during the interaction the specific factors and then adjust your approach as you go forward.
So let's talk a bit about the common mistakes people make then. So you're looking for social cues in order to figure out to readjust or to realign where you're going with the conversation. What are some of the other common mistakes people make in social engineering, I guess, one on one?
Sure. So one of the biggest ones is from scientifically called reification. It's the idea that some type of abstract or non-concrete thing controls your behavior. Ego is kind of a classic example, right? When they say, "Oh, someone did that because of their ego, or their ego caused them to do that," right? Maybe not in so many words, but that's kind of what the gist is. Ego is an abstract concept; it's not a thing. So, from a control perspective or manipulation perspective, that also doesn't give us any information about how to manipulate or control your behavior, right? So when we say someone is, you know, controlled by their ego or their ego caused them to do something, one common interpretation of that from a more scientific perspective is they are heavily reinforced by the attention of others. For example, people that might be heavily reinforced by attention from the media, like the news media. In fact, they might do all sorts of outlandish things just to get the focus of the news media on them. Again, it's this idea of switching from the abstract, such as ego generally, to a much more concrete, observable thing. So attention by media, or more specifically airtime, or attention from people, is something that you can observe and affect, manipulate, right? So we would say that the independent variables in that case would be the attention by others or the attention by the media, right? The news coverage and stuff like that. So another classic one is also the idea of kind of confusing cause and effect. So like if let's say someone went to the refrigerator to get a beer. Um, the the issue there is that they're saying that the cause they wanted to get the beer, or they got the beer, it occurs after the effect, them going to the fridge, right? So it's kind of it's called teleology, or a teleological like, explanation. For example, if someone secretly removed that beer from the fridge, the person still would go there. They just wouldn't find the beer there afterwards. They might not go back. Um, and another one that actually, if you think about, or if you read up on things like neurolinguistic programming, this one is also quite common. It's called violating parsimony, or Occam's razor. Right. So we mentioned the whole idea of Occam's razor is things should not be multiplied unnecessarily. So that means you shouldn't introduce new causes or new suggestions of cause, basically the independent variables, especially if you aren't observing them. All sorts of examples from NLP. I'd have to grab some books, but off the top of my head. So, for instance, the classic thing is looking up to the left or right. I can't remember which direction means that someone's lying. Well, not really. Not only do you have the reification of lying as a general abstract concept, but also, two, you're assuming that whatever internal processes associated with deception are the cause, even though you have no specific observations to go with that. And in fact, science does. In fact, there have been scientific experiments to demonstrate that's not true.
So figuring out if somebody's lying based on their behavior then is going to be, I guess, theoretical at best.
Figuring it out based on their lying is a very questionable concept at best. In fact, when it comes to detecting deception, it's actually a lot more. There's actually so detecting deception is from a classical perspective, or I guess like a television or media perspective, isn't really how it works in real life. Um, so when we talk about deception, right, or like techniques to look for someone that's lying, a lot of people will fall back upon, or like if you watch TV shows like The Mentalist, and to some degree Lie to Me, when it was on years ago, a lot of people think about something called a Pinocchio tell. This is a behavior that occurs only when lying. Sometimes people say, like I've heard everything from someone tapping their foot to someone not making eye contact to like touching their nose when they speak, right? All of these, when they're described that way, they say, "Oh, well, they're doing that. That means they're lying." That's considered a Pinocchio tale. It doesn't hold water when it comes to science. Uh, in fact, when we're talking about detecting deception, there's really two components. One is identifying behaviors that could suggest deception, and then two is investigating what is causing those behaviors. So,
So, do any of the, let's say, facial expressions or facts, which maybe we should define what those are, but could those be used to identify deception?
okay, sure. So let's talk about facts and facial expressions since people think about them a lot. So when it comes to when it comes to a facial expression, in terms of deception and research and facial expression research, a lot of times there's a focus on what's called the facial expression of emotion, which is more specifically a set of facial movements or facial behaviors that correspond with one of the seven what they call basic emotion categories. So fear, anger, disgust, joy, contempt, sadness, and surprise. So these are categories, if you will, of emotional experiences that have, through scientific study, demonstrated to have a higher than chance correlation with emotional experiences, right? So the idea that when you see these expressions uh, or these specific facial movements, sets of facial movements, they've been correlated, not which is not the same as a causal factor, but they've been correlated with certain emotional experiences. So when it comes to correlation, especially when we talk about more of a statistical scientific measure, it's rarely, well, in this case, definitely not 100%. Meaning, just because you see someone make specific sets of facial expressions, let's say that correlate with contempt or with surprise or sadness, doesn't guarantee that they're actually experiencing that emotion. And even if they were, you still wouldn't necessarily know the cause, which goes back to the idea of the second part of assessing deceptive behaviors, which is investigation, right? Investigating what's actually causing or why are those expressions occurring. So when we talk about facts, since you mentioned facts, so facts stands for the facial action coding system. It's a scientific measurement system for measuring facial quote unquote behaviors. In more basic terms, it's measuring specific facial movements, both in still photographs and in videos. And the basic idea behind the way it works, or kind of like what it's all about, is assigning numeric codes to specific facial movements. So they typically call these numeric codes action units, or AUs for short. And each given facial movement has a specific AU associated with it. So, for example, pulling the corners of your lips back and up towards your ears, like my classic smile, is AU 12. Pulling up just the inner portion of your eyebrow is an example of AU 1. I'm looking at the screen right now, and it looks like you're doing AU 4. Well, there's an AU 12 and AU
Well,
7.
I'll tell you what I'm feeling. I'm wondering, is facts, I guess, due to the amount of time that it takes to calculate, Is that a
Hmm.
system that can be used within a live social engineering engagement, or is that something that's more theoretical that you can, if you had footage of the engagement, they can then go back to analyze afterwards? Is it like it's something you can use in real time, or is it just for after the fact analysis?
So fax isn't can't actually be used in real time. At least not by humans. There have been some there were some attempts to computerize it and perhaps have computers analyze video in real time, right? But the processing power of a computer is well beyond that of a human's in real time, especially during social engineering interaction because you're trying to monitor so many things, right? We talked before about like, what types of things are reinforcing behavior, like during a conversation, right? So you'd be focused on a lot of things all at once. Um, because facts is scientific, again, going back to the idea of science, accuracy is paramount. Facts is not meant to be used real time and never really was. So, in and of itself, facts probably isn't applicable for social engineering. In fact, just to give you an idea about the amount of time it takes to properly code a fax video, like a segment of video with facts, the average coding time is usually anywhere from 1 to 60 to 1 to 100, meaning for 1 minute of video, it usually takes anywhere from 60 to 100 minutes to properly fully fax code that video segment. Yeah, so real time isn't going to be an option. But what fax does help with, from a both social engineering and deception perspective, is it helps you focus on the idea of separating your observations from your inferences. So fax is a measurement system. It's kind of like a ruler, right? There isn't an interpretation with fax. In fact, there we go. The fax manual is very specific about that, right? It's literally assigning numeric codes to facial movements or facial behaviors, right? They have the whole coding system with rules and all that good stuff. But in terms of emotions, right, there is no facts doesn't have any concept of emotion. It's just numbers. Just like an inch is an inch. Is that big? Is that small? Right. Well, that's an interpretation. Big or small is an interpretation. An inch is just an inch, right? A ruler tells you an inch is an inch. What that means to you is completely different.
So yeah, no,
So
that's
the
that.
other
Sorry, go ahead.
no, no, go on.
Yeah, because yeah, no, that makes sense. I was just wondering from like a practical perspective, right? So if we're going to be like improving our capabilities in social engineering, are there differences then? Like, are there certain personalities that are easier or harder to manipulate?
So when it comes to things like personalities and stuff like that, you have to be careful how you define a personality because it's really the way people tend to define personalities, at least as I've seen it being used in social engineering, really doesn't make a whole bunch of sense because it tries to categorize a person as something without considering context, right? Why someone behaves in a specific way has many contextual variables, and to say that someone is an angry person doesn't really tell you anything about the context. So they might be angry now, and maybe 5 minutes later they aren't responding as an angry person. Um,
On the other hand, though, you're talking to them in a certain state, so
yeah,
you don't have to
you're
take that
talking
into
to
consideration.
You do, but that's not so much a thing as assigning them a static personality, right? So when you say, are certain personality types easier, more difficult to manipulate or assess or something like that, it's really trying to assign a static state to a person when people, especially the behavior, isn't really something like that, right? It's not static. The reasons why we behave the way we do is based off of the factors that affect us, not so much a personality isn't a factor. At best, it could be considered a general description of someone's behavior, but even that doesn't really help you much when it comes to manipulation.
So we
The
couldn't have
biggest
somebody who has a big ego to use that as a leverage to be able to manipulate them easier than somebody who didn't have that perhaps vulnerability.
so let's dive that back. So when you say ego, right? How do you manipulate someone's ego?
I mean, let's say using the example that you gave before, somebody who wants a lot of attention. So that is something that they have a need, they have a clear
Well, so
need, and then you can use that to manipulate their behavior, as opposed to somebody who doesn't have a obvious need, in which case you don't have something that you can offer them that they want.
sure. So when we talk about ego, right? Ego. in and of itself, describing that as a cause to say someone's, driven by ego, again, isn't as useful for figuring out how to manipulate them when we say, okay, they're driven by attention, right? Specifically, let's say, human attention. So now we can now that's something that we can talk about, right? We can talk about, okay, if I give them attention as they speak, right, they're more likely to speak. When I break the attention, they may, try and get the attention back, right? Or they may stop, right? So the idea is that as an independent variable, the attention that you give them while they're talking can affect the behavior. So if you know that, right, then you can go ahead and yes, use that to your advantage, or to try and go ahead and pivot the conversation, or facilitate them continuing to talk, that type of stuff.
Okay, so a goal then in social engineering could be to figure out what the target, what I guess, what needs they would have that you can then manipulate to then use those to your advantage. And I'm just wondering, and a person who doesn't have obvious, I'm trying to think of the right word for this, but something obvious that they need. So like the attention is a great example. If there's not obvious, then those I would think would be perhaps harder to manipulate, at least in the short term.
Sure, sure. But so from a social engineering perspective, like if we think about, let's say you want to build up a if you have a specific target that let's say you're going to go ahead and try and elicit information from, one of the classic things to do is kind of build up a profile of them ahead of time. Find out what are their activities, what do they do online, what types of things do they like, what types of things do they not like, that type of stuff. And then as best you can, make some initial guesses as to what might be reinforcing or what might not be. Generally speaking, right, there are some things that we tend to fall upon, or that you can usually safely assume is at least for initial trial. Again, like I said, while you're speaking to someone, literally even something as simple as making eye contact can either facilitate or reduce the likelihood of them talking. Um, if you have more detailed information, for example, let's say that I know that you're a huge sports fan. Maybe you like soccer or football, or a specific team, right? We can use that to also as knowing that. Well, now I know that you like to talk about sports. If the conversation starts dropping, I can probably just mention one or two things about sports, and there's probably a greater chance that, oh, hey, all of a sudden it starts picking back up. Now, what I was going to say, if you're trying to assess some of the things that might also more specifically might influence someone like ego, because that's an easy example to refer to. Um, what you do is you look at also their past behavior, right? So if someone is reinforced by attention a lot, you start watch. If you observe them before you approach them, you'll see them trying to get other people to pay attention to them, whether that's flagging, tapping them on the shoulder, being loud and obnoxious, right, which also garners attention. Um, Being, the social person, constantly, are they constantly talking to someone, right? That type of stuff. All of those could be suggestive of perhaps, attention is reinforcing for them.
Are there things that we can do, I guess, from a defensive standpoint to identify the fact that somebody's trying to social engineer us?
So yes and no. It depends on the social engineer. Depends on specifically what's going on. In context of like a classic phishing email, sure, right. There's usually because phishing emails usually have limited interaction. In many cases, they're just sent out, one go at a time, or like just kind of what I call a spray and pray, or right, where someone sends out a whole bunch of emails hoping one or two people click on the link. Usually, those types of emails will either not make sense, so they'll be out of context. Um, you could try verifying the information, right? They'll In many cases, many organizations will not necessarily ask you to click on a link, but hey, who knows? That's your normal maybe that's your normal course of business. So for something specific like an email, you could look for various different anomalies and stuff like that. If we're talking about well-tuned elicitation, right, during a conversation and stuff like that, um, it can be very difficult to identify. And from a defensive perspective, I mean, some of the best pieces of advice to give someone without lots of training is, right, try to limit, be cognizant of what you're talking about, and and especially from an employee's like a security awareness program perspective, make sure your employees know what types of things they shouldn't be talking about. So the downside of this is that properly done social engineering is very difficult to detect. Um, so
So
because
there's no
it
easy
feels
way
like normal
to
human
defend it.
interaction. I mean, one could state that the way I got your cell phone number earlier would be a form of social engineering, right? In which case I made it contingent upon, hey, I need to send you a document, what's your cell, what's your signal contact and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, well done social engineering isn't obvious because it looks like a normal interaction. In fact, from an elicitation perspective, like when we talk about eliciting information in person, it's all really just a guided conversation. So how does one conversation that's with a clandestine motive look different than a conversation that doesn't have such motive? I mean, if you're to go back through and keep track of everything that was talked about, you could probably pick out, oh, hey, we talked about something sensitive here. But if your guard is down, right, especially if the person that you're conversing with has built up some rapport, the chance of you picking it up on the fly is probably a lot less. So, generally speaking, trying to be prepared and knowing what, like, especially from an elicitation perspective, what you don't want to be talking about, and then making sure that you steer that conversation away from there.
That makes sense. All right, to close up, do you have any interesting stories that anything odd that you've come across within a social engineering engagement?
Um, uh, Nothing I'd like to purposely admit to. I mess up a lot more than I succeed. I'll go for that. That's for sure. Um, I was gonna say, I can give you a few words of advice, like stick with what you can observe rather than what you infer, right? And try and keep those two separate. Um, and especially when it comes to elicitation, like talking, like eliciting information from people, uh, realize the more you talk, the less the other person's talking, right? And if they have the information you want, they need to be the one talking.
That's good advice. All right, if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
So my corporate website is socialexploits.com. Or they can just find me on either Twitter as Social Exploits or on LinkedIn as Michael Murr.
All right, Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, sir, for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Thanks again for listening. If you haven't already joined our newsletter and you want to stay current with the latest data breaches and ransomware attacks, you really should at breachsense.io. And I'll be back in your earbuds next Thursday morning.